and welcome to Tips, the podcast from Ausha that gives you all the key tips to launch and boost the growth of your podcast. I'm Sarah, Ausha's US podcast ambassador, and this new episode of Tips is all about the conclusion of your podcast. I want you to have the tools to have the best conclusion possible and avoid having the end of your episode fall flat. In the previous episodes of Tips, we saw how to write a captivating introduction and how to create a well-crafted script for your podcast. So, it's only logical that today it's time to attack the oh-so-important final part of a podcast, the conclusion. Remember in your high school English class when your teacher droned on and on about the importance of a strong introduction and conclusion for your essays? Well, for a podcast, you need the same thing. So here are my 10 recommendations for an excellent conclusion. I know, 10 sounds like a lot, but it's going to go by fast. Just trust me. Recommendation number 1, take the time to write your conclusion. Don't rush it and don't improvise it, because the conclusion of your podcast is essential to end on a high note. It's used to retain your listeners and to make them come back to your show. And yet, when you create a podcast, you can perfectly imagine the theme of your first episodes, the cover, the questions to ask your guests. But the conclusion? Well, it's usually the last thing you think about because it's the last thing of the podcast. But have you ever heard a podcast without a conclusion? No, you haven't. And there are many reasons for that. The first is that the end of an episode without a good conclusion can seem a bit abrupt. It just feels like you're speaking and then. The second is that it simply doesn't seem professional. However, by now you realize that your audience is not only connected to your podcast for its messages, but also to you and your personality that brings it to life. It's essential to have a strong finish with every episode. You're an audio gymnast who needs a clean dismount to get that perfect 10. Okay, but what do you say in your conclusion? Start with the basics. Thank those that listen to your new episode in its entirety. I know it seems obvious, but saying the little magic word of thank you is always nice. Slipping a thank you to your loyal listeners and sincerely thanking them for their commitment and active listening shows that you value them, and at the same time gives them a feeling of belonging in your community, and it just gives me all the warm fuzzies. If your podcast episode was content heavy, take the time in your conclusion to do a summary of all the ideas that you and your guest or guest covered in your episode. Besides, no matter what type of podcast you have, I'm sure your listeners have learned a lot from your content. And so they don't lose any important information, try including a recap of your episode during the conclusion. Think of your teacher saying, "And what have we learned today?" There's a reason why it's good to review the core themes of your podcast episode during the conclusion. It's satisfying for your listeners. I mean, I listen to one episode of The Daily and feel like an expert, so the wrap-up is crucial. But just be careful that your recap doesn't become another podcast, especially if your podcast is short, because if I did a detailed recap of tips, it would basically just be another episode. If your listeners reach your conclusion, it's because they listened to your entire episode from start to finish. And if they listen to your entire episode, it's certainly because they like your content or the personality of your host, which could be you, or both. So it's very likely that they will want to follow you on other channels in order to get to know you more. Therefore, your conclusion is the ideal moment to invite your audience to visit your website, subscribe to your newsletter, buy your book, or follow you on social media. I mean, we've all heard it on literally every podcast. But be careful not to ask too much from your audience. Limit the number of calls to action you have per episode, or you could risk losing listeners. Anything over 3 calls to action can feel like too much, and your listeners risk not doing anything you've asked them to do. So choose your calls to action well. Prioritize. If your objective is to boost the sales of your book, your message will be different than if you wish to grow your fan base on social media. Just be smart about it and don't give them too much homework, because they might not do it. What's better than giving your podcast listeners a preview of your next episode? If you've planned ahead enough to know your next topic, make them want to keep listening by teasing them with the next episode. I mean, have you ever seen an episode of Real Housewives? The scenes from the next are always the best part. For this, you have 2 possibilities. The first is to briefly announce the subject of your next episode yourself in a few sentences. The second is to insert a clip from your next episode at the end of your current episode, which is always my preference. Another common practice for podcasters: use the conclusion of your episode to ask your audience to give feedback on your podcast. The large majority of podcasters ask their audience to leave reviews on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. I mean, hello, I'm doing it on every episode of this podcast. The reviews that you receive on listening platforms are very important, not only for your natural referencing, SEO, but also to convince other listeners who haven't already listened to your show. Good reviews equals more potential listeners. Once again, during your conclusion, you're talking to the creme de la creme of your audience because they are the ones who have listened to your entire episode. So take advantage of this to engage with them more and ask them what they'd like to hear in your next episodes. While asking them to participate in the construction of your show, you show that you value them even more. And most of all, you're sure to create the content that they'll like. 8th recommendation. And yes, we're already on the 8th one. It's just flying by today. If your listeners liked your episode, they'll probably be up for supporting your show one way or another. If you launch a crowdfunding campaign, give them a little nudge to support it when concluding your episode. 9th recommendation. Like the music in your intro, it's important to choose good music for your conclusion as well. You can use the same music or choose a different song for every episode. One podcast I absolutely loved, Dead Eyes, had a different outro song from the same artist, Amy Mann, for every episode. Whatever you choose, your musical choices must correspond to the tone of your podcast, whether it's dramatic, chill, or epic. Finally, no one does Easter eggs better than Marvel. Well, except maybe the Easter Bunny. And yes, I have a point for recommendation 10. Stay with me, okay? In pretty much all of their films, there are hidden added scenes during or at the end of the credits. And Marvel fans know that you have to stay all the way until the end to see them. You can do the same thing with your podcast. At the end of your episode, after thanking your listeners, you can add a few seconds of additional content. A joke with one of your guests that you cut during editing, bonus content, a promotional code, whatever you want. Get creative. We've reached the end of this new episode of Tips, and now you know how to make a superb conclusion. If you're hearing this message, it's because you stayed until the end, so thank you, thank you, thank you. If you want, you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts and now also on Spotify. And be sure to share this episode with your friends. If you have any subject ideas that you want me to talk about on Tips, tell me in the comments or on the Ausha social media pages. See you next week for a new episode. Ausha Originals. This show is brought to you by Ausha, the all-in-one podcast hosting and marketing platform to help you grow your podcast. Do.